Thank you very much. Sasha, you are the founding CEO of a think tank that looks at all these dangers, but also at the interlinkages. You don't look at isolated points, but you have a pretty good overview. I think this leads directly to the question. Did you see the storm on the Capitol? Did you see this coming? Was this apparent in the data you're analyzing and your colleagues, you're looking at it day to day?
Thank you so much, Silke. It's wonderful to be here with you. I mean, the short answer is yes. If there were ever a more visible, jarring and extraordinary challenge to a mature democratic process, I can't think of one in recent history. It was shocking, but for those of us studying the online information ecosystem, it wasn't a surprise. And that wasn't just because of the extraordinary and heightened levels of weaponized hate, of conspiracy, of extremism, of disinformation that we monitored across the open and closed parts of the web over the past year, including one of the longer standing and most, I suppose, successful disinformation, voter fraud disinformation campaigns that we've seen in an electoral context. But it's also because of the longer transformation, if you like, in the organizational dynamics, in the communications tactics of an array of bad actors that we've watched really over the last decade go essentially unchallenged. And so it wasn't a surprise. And the question I think that we need to be asking ourselves is how quickly do we need to solve this before this becomes a systemic, perhaps an existential challenge for us here in Europe. Of course, we have policies afoot that I think are encouraging. But I think the thing that I took away from this was I suppose the interconnection of three things. As I mentioned, this sort of transformation, the coalescence of and aligning at a sort of unprecedented level of a whole array of bad actors, combined with a kind of hypercharging, a result of the, if you like, the technological architecture of the platforms Shoshana's talked about, that massive amplification, if you like, of content that comes closest to the red line of extreme messaging, and ultimately a kind of information ecosystem segregation that we've seen happen over the last 5 years in particular. And that's reflected both on and offline.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm going to ask you, how quickly do we need to act? You asked the question. Do you have an answer to that?
I think Shoshana said just at the end, you know, how everything is speeding up. We have to act extremely quickly because where I think there have been doubts, certainly, you know, in our research, for instance, of extremism and terrorism, let's say 5-6 years ago, it was hard actually to convince many policymakers that there was in fact a correlation between online activity and offline real world action. I think that penny now has dropped when we see the scale of the impact, let's say, of COVID disinformation and anti-vax disinformation. If we see the very real impact that electoral disinformation has had in this recent election, I think that penny has dropped. So what we do know is that self-regulatory attempts to date, be they in a European context and in an international context, have fallen short. And
I think that penny has dropped, because
otherwise,
I think
that penny has also dropped fundamentally within certain contexts, but perhaps not in all. And I think we're yet to see what happens with the new administration in the United States. I think there is optimism that there will be an openness for transatlantic engagement around this policy and regulatory space in a way that perhaps wasn't there before. But time is of the essence, there is no question.
Thank you very much. Sasha, who should be the referee?
I mean, it's a really interesting conversation, and the point that you've raised about the kind of trade-off between free speech and censorship at the heart of this debate is an important one. But I think it's largely misrepresented, and I think that in part the companies have gotten behind that misrepresentation because it serves their ends quite well. What we actually see is the distortion of the information ecosystem by these platforms. This isn't actually a free speech environment. It's a distortive environment of speech. You talked about, Shoshana talked a little bit about, in a way, the agnostic dynamics of the platforms. They are indeed agnostic to content, but they're not content neutral. So I just give you a couple of bits of data from others in our research, starting with Facebook's own research, which was leaked a couple of years ago from 2016, that found that 64% of all extremist group joins are due to their own recommendations algorithm. Our own research on Holocaust denial content showed that that content was still being recommended to users. It wasn't that we had to go searching, but it came to us, if you like. The disproportionate breakthrough that we've seen now and engagement rates with disinformation, number one, in relation to COVID. So we did an analysis of disinformation, COVID disinformation versus the reach and engagement rates around, let's say, the WHO's website, their information. The WHO's content was reaching on Facebook and engaging with some 6 million people. The disinformation that we were tracking was reaching in the order of 80 plus million people and engaging with that number. Similarly, just now with this vote fraud disinformation, and that the alleged voter fraud content, we saw that content reaching double the amount, engaging with double the amount of people on Facebook than the sort of best performing content that was denying such allegations. So you see a sort of systems problem here. And where I think we need to head is beyond content approaches to policy and regulation. We need to get to the systems approach. And I think this is where the DSA actually takes extraordinary steps forward. Transparency is absolutely critical, but that transparency has to be regulated, it has to be computational. And we believe it needs to be a transparency that's regulated across not just the algorithmic dynamics that we've just talked about, but the policies, the processes, the outcomes. We need to have visibility of those processes, those policies and those outcomes in relation to these very important things that the companies do, in relation to content moderation and redress, in relation to advertising, and in relation to those systems and architecture, the algorithmic piece. There are examples from other sectors, the financial services sector, around algorithmic audit that I think give us a sense of how this can be done. It is something that is doable, but we need now to move towards that systems-based approach, because it deals with your question, Silke. Who gets to decide what's true and false? Nobody. What we should be deciding on is access to the data that gives us an understanding of how the information ecosystem is being distorted and what the public health, safety, security outcomes of that distortion are. On the basis of that data, on the basis of that transparency, then we can start to make decisions in full view of that information, which, by the way, nobody has today. Nobody has that access, neither governments nor indeed civil society nor researchers. Nobody has that access. Then we can start to make informed decisions within liberal democracies where we debate how we address those societal outcomes of the design of the architecture of these platforms.
If I understand that correctly, you need a lot of transparency to make a bit of a good decision and to have a full picture of what's going on.
And you need an audience that wants to be informed. I think this is also part of the problem.
From my colleague Malte Fischer, he's asking, would it make a difference if we established a law giving us the ownership of our data? Would that make a big change? I mean, would it change things? No.
I think that the fundamental issue here is having regulated oversight, democratic oversight of the processes that we've just talked about. It ultimately comes down to that, which isn't so different from, of course, what we do in relation to other industries. And so shouldn't be such a stretch of the imagination. what we've really seen in the recent period is a sort of fringe insurgency, exactly what Shoshana said. We've called it the fringe insurgency. We've seen those groups and ideas and movements that ultimately people believed to be small-scale fringe grouplets mainstream themselves, normalize themselves successfully, with a systemic impact on our democratic civic culture. This question of organic versus inorganic, that has to be applied to this dichotomy that's often presented around speech and censorship. Speech, I think, is only really to be called speech if it is, in fact, organic. If it is inorganically amplified and targeted, that's not really what we mean by it. And ultimately, we need a regulatory system that levels the playing field again for speech, where good can outcompete bad ideas. Just as Shoshana said, we set about trying to do just that at the outset with our work on extremism and indeed terrorist content, sort of interestingly mobilizing civil society in this space to outcompete bad with good. And what we realized quite quickly is that the cards were stacked against us, that it was never going to quite work. And it was for these reasons. Number one, that bad actors deploy bad behaviors online, your bots and they game the system, fakery of all kinds. And secondly, that the system itself tilts in the interest of extreme messaging. Mainstreamed extremism is a systemic threat to democracy long-term. We have to know it. This is not the public square, it's the private square that we're talking about, but we need a public square. In the German elections in 2017, we found that by and large, voters voting for mainstream parties were still imbibing mainstream media. And those that were voting AfD were almost exclusively imbibing their information from an alternative media ecosystem, largely online. That information segregation and fragmentation that we're seeing is undermining the public square. It has a huge set of implications. So for me, it's not about necessarily your data ownership, although I like the idea of having absolutely a system that gives you back more control over how your data is utilized. But that system needs to be one of transparency, as I've said, across the policies, processes, and outcomes of these platforms.
I'd like to thank all my lovely panelists. I think this was my first ever all-female panel. I'd like to thank you all for your insightful contributions. I think this is a discussion that we should follow up on soon because it's just extremely relevant and it cannot be stressed enough. Christine, over to you.